There is something to be said about U.S. ships in the early 1900s. We've talked about the USS Eldridge disappearing and reappearing in the Philadelphia experiment. But what about the ship that just vanished? Follow me down the rabbit hole to learn more about the USS Cyclops. Hello, friends. Welcome back to the rabbit hole. I'm Danny. I'm your host, and today we are talking about the USS Cyclops. My husband shared it with me so I could share it with you. I had never heard about it, but this is going to lead us into a second episode. So you don't have to listen to the USS Cyclops in order to listen to the next episode, but I highly suggest it. Anyway, let's go all the way back. 105 years after the disappearance of the USS Cyclops, there are still no answers as to what happened to the ship. And 309 souls on board. So, this ship, gone. No trace of it. There's no wreckage. There's nothing. All the people, gone. We never found a body. Nothing. Nothing. Still to this day, we've found nothing. We have all this technology now. Anyway, the USS Cyclops was built as a fuel ship back in May of 1910 by William Cramp and Sons, and it was the second of 4 Proteus-class colliers built for the U.S. Navy before World War I. And actually, it wasn't initially in the Navy. It did get commissioned when World War I. We're gonna get there. When World War I broke out, basically they're like, we need the ship. But the ship was built in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Imagine that. And can we just say there has to be something going on in Philadelphia shipyard? Like something weird is going on there. Because not only did the USS Cyclops vanish, its sister ships, all the sister ships that were built also met very weird deaths. And obviously we had the Philadelphia experiment. If you haven't listened to that episode, highly recommend it. It has nothing to do with this episode. I just recommend that episode because it's really cool and I love it a lot. That's all. Anyway, back to this. So the Cyclops was placed in service in November of 1910, and the ship was the second naval vessel to bear the name Cyclops. Again, right now it's not, like in 1910 it wasn't a naval ship yet, but it is the second naval vessel to bear the name Cyclops. I could not find any information on the first Cyclops anywhere, so I don't really know if it also met an untimely demise or if they just simply decommissioned it when they couldn't use it anymore, or kind of like what happened with that. When you look up naval vessel Cyclops, this is the only one that comes up. So I could not find anything about the first one, and I was really curious. Did the first one also vanish or die in a weird way? Die. Ships don't die. I mean, they kind of do, but you know what I'm saying? Couldn't find it. I'm sorry, guys. But so she operated with the Naval Auxiliary Service Atlantic Fleet, where she voyaged in the Baltic to supply 2nd Division ships. So the Naval Auxiliary Service is what is now the Navy Reserves. So just in case you're curious, back then, Naval Auxiliary Service. So she did that from May to July of 1911. And after this, she mainly operated on the East Coast. She first returned to Norfolk, Virginia after being in the Baltic, and then she went from Newport, Rhode Island to the Caribbean, servicing the fleet basically as needed. So whoever needed help, and she's a fuel ship, right? So she carried extra coal, would give people whatever they needed. During the U.S. occupation of Veracruz in Mexico in 1914 and 1915, she coaled ships on patrol there. So she also helped evacuate refugees. And just for a little bit of history on that, the U.S. occupation of Veracruz began with the Battle of Veracruz. And this occupation was the response to the Tampico affair, where Mexican forces detained 9 American sailors. The occupation actually worsened already terrible relations between Mexico and America, and this led to a widespread anti-Americanism in Mexico. Just in case you're curious, and the USS Cyclops helped there. So when America entered World War I, the Cyclops was commissioned on May 1st of 19 1917, and she joined a convoy headed for St. Nazaire, France in June, and then returned to the U.S. in July of 1917. She also made one voyage to Halifax, Nova Scotia outside of that, and she returned to serving along the East Coast until January of 1918. That's when she was assigned to the Naval Overseas Transportation Service, and then she sailed to Brazilian waters to fuel British ships in the South Atlantic. This is where things get weird, right? So she goes to Brazil, goes to Rio de Janeiro, and fills up. She gets all these things. Things are going to get weird here. So the ship left Rio de Janeiro on February 16th of 1918. So they were in Rio for like 3-ish weeks before they left. She got to Salvador on February 20th. And 2 days later, the Cyclops departed Salvador with her sights set to Baltimore, Maryland. So she was not supposed to stop anywhere else. They didn't have any other scheduled stops between Salvador and Maryland. They were supposed to go straight there. But what is of note is that they were carrying manganese ore, and manganese is used as an alloying agent in steel to give it like its toughness. So she was carrying this, which was unusual for a collier to carry, but we'll get into that later anyway. And there were rumors that the ship was overloaded when it left Brazil. So her max capacity was like 8,000 long tons or 8,100 tons. I don't know what long tons is, but 8,100 tons. And these rumors were later proven false, that she wasn't overloaded. Although throughout all of my research, everyone keeps saying, well, she was overloaded, that's why she sank, blah, blah, blah. But the records in Brazil say that she wasn't overloaded, that she was loaded perfectly fine, that everything was fine, and that's where she was loaded. So I don't know why she stopped in Salvador. She didn't pick up like anything else, but they were having engine issues. So before leaving, Commander Worley submitted a report stating that the starboard engine had a cracked cylinder and basically was inoperative. They could not use it. So they only had the port engine, no starboard engine. And the report was confirmed by the survey board. However, they recommended that the ship just return to the US. And so I don't know much about ships. I know I was in the Navy, but I flew. I never went to sea. I saw a ship one time, I think, but I've never actually been on a ship. But my in-laws actually worked on tugboats in Alaska for a number of years, so I called them. I was like, all right, cool. So I'm doing this research for this episode, and I have some questions. And they are very kind, so they answered all my questions. They told me that the ship would basically it would be fine to only use the port engine to make it back to the US. It would have been slower with only one engine, obviously, and they would have had to do a lot of counter steering because the ship would have wanted to pull, but it is completely possible for the ship with only one operable engine to return to the US. So I don't think that the ship only having one engine had anything to do with its disappearance at all. I think that, that sucks, but they were totally fine. And it seems like they weren't over capacity weight-wise, but they did make an unexpected stop in Barbados because the water level was over the Plimsoll line. So the Plimsoll line is also known as the International Load Line, and it indicates the legal limit to which a ship may be loaded for specific water types and temperatures in order to safely maintain buoyancy, right? So if we don't want a ship to sink, it needs to be loaded only to this line. So it's how deep in the water that ship is sitting, right? So the more weight, the lower it's going to sit, and it could get really dangerous if we're not careful. Well, that's why they pulled over in Barbados. Well, later on, like when we get there, later in my episode, there's going to be this letter that comes from the consul in Barbados to the State Department, and he doesn't mention this, that they're overloaded or that why the Cyclops stopped in Barbados. And the letter that was sent right before they called off the search for the ship and basically like called it gone, vanished with all the people on board deceased. But you think that he would have mentioned something about like them being there, which was abnormal or whatever. He was just like stating like what they took. Again, I'm going to get into all this in a little while. So let's get there.
Did you know that over 40% of Americans have a hard time swallowing pills? So when it's time to take your vitamins, large capsules and pills are out of the question. We know that gummy vitamins exist, but they're full of sugar, they get stuck in your teeth, and they only contain a fraction of the nutrients you need. Luckily, Easy Melts has discovered the ultimate vitamin sweet spot. Vitamins that melt in your mouth, taste like a treat, and are packed with nutrients ready for absorption, all without an ounce of sugar. For a limited time, Easy Melts is giving listeners a free 3-month supply of vitamin D3 with their first purchase. To claim your free D3 vitamins, visit try.easymelts.com/spring24. That's melts.com/spring24. Say goodbye to the old way of taking your vitamins and say hello to the easy way. Menopausal and perimenopausal women, listen up. It's time to take control of your health and comfort, and Winona is here to help. Winona is a telemedicine company for menopause care who believes that your symptoms are real, important, and deserve to be taken seriously. And for many women, this starts with hormone replacement therapy. Winona's HRT is made with plant-based, bioidentical hormones rather than synthetic ones, so it better aligns with your body to offer relief from hot flashes, weight gain, and other uncomfortable symptoms. 80% of women who use Winona find relief within just 90 days. So, what are you waiting for? Get started today. Visit buywinona.com today to start your free visit. With free shipping and the ability to pause or cancel at any time, your path to wellness has zero obligations. Use code SPRING24 at buywinona.com for 25% off your first treatment plan. That's BYWINONA.com for 25% off. Winona. Menopause care made easy.
Anyway, so they thought that the ship, they pulled it over in Barbados because it's an international load line. So internationally, it has to be below, like their ship can't sit below that line. The investigation in Rio proved that the ship had been loaded and secured properly. So unless they picked up extra things in Salvador, like things that weren't on the manifest, their ship should have been loaded properly. So after this one stop, they continued on their way to Maryland. They left Barbados on March 4th. There was a rumor that on the 9th of March, the ship was spotted near Virginia by the molasses tanker Imolco. So the captain did deny this rumor. The captain of the Imolco was like, nope, that didn't happen. But that doesn't mean that it isn't true, I guess. But the Cyclops wasn't due to Baltimore until the 13th of March. And with only one engine, she would have been moving like so much slower. So it's likely that they would have been behind schedule instead of that far ahead of schedule. And then being spotted in Virginia only puts them a day away from Maryland. So they would have got there 3 days early, which seems very unlikely. So I think this spotting, maybe they just saw another ship, a sister ship, something else, not the Cyclops. But some people swear that the rumors are true. The day after the alleged spotting of the ship, a massive storm rolled through the Virginia area. So some theorize that the weather, along with the overloaded ship and the one engine, caused the ship to sink in the water out there. But a thorough search was done of this area because of this rumor, and there was no wreckage found, nor did any ever really wash up on the shores of the East Coast. And you think that Virginia would have gotten some wreckage. Somewhere along the East Coast, they would have gotten some wreckage, especially if they were so close to be spotted by this tanker. I mean, they're still out in open waters, but they're not that far out. They for sure, and they, again, it was the next day. So a little bit further up the East Coast, you think that the wreckage would have washed in, or at least a piece of wreckage would have washed in. And in case you didn't know, the USS Cyclops never made it to Baltimore. They completely vanished off the face of the planet. But the sister ships have some weird things going on too. So during World War II, Cyclops' sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, also vanished at sea. So like the Cyclops, both sister ships were carrying heavy loads of metallic ore. And actually in both those cases they were carrying the exact same kind, but not what the Cyclops was carrying. And both cases were theorized to have been a result of catastrophic structural failure. The conspiracy is that all these ships were lost to the Bermuda Triangle. The thing that gets me is that no wreckage was ever found, nor did any wash up anywhere. So that's where I'm like, it's got to be the Bermuda Triangle, right? Because, like, if they just the catastrophic structural failure, you're gonna find a ship. You're gonna find things off the ship. They found things from the Titanic for forever, right? Like it. Obviously, I mean, people survived the Titanic. I understand that it's different, but I'm just saying that you're not getting any wreckage anywhere, ever. Like it just doesn't make any sense. Rear Admiral George Van Deeris suggested that all ships could have been lost to structural failure because of issues with the I-beams eroding. So some of the cargo they carried could be quite corrosive, and they observed this on the USS Jason. And another ship similar was the Chucky, and the Chucky snapped in two during calm seas. So they were like, that's weird. But in both those cases, along with the Proteus and Nereus, they were in use for so much longer than the Cyclops was. So they were in use until like the late 1930s, early 1940s, like World War II time frame. It wasn't like this is just a couple years old. So was the Cyclops just carrying extra corrosive material, like more corrosive material than anybody else? They were all commissioned or all put into service around the same time, within the same year. They were all put into service. So you're telling me that the Cyclops just happened to erode faster and it corroded and it structural failure. Oh, but we didn't find any piece of it ever. I'm not believing it. I'm not doing it. So, sorry, Rear Admiral, your cover-up's not working. On June 1st of 1918, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he declared that the USS Cyclops was officially lost and all hands were deceased. So, they did their searches, but they were also still in war, or still at war, excuse me. So, don't worry. Things get weirder, because you've got this super shady captain captaining the USS Cyclops. So the captain of the Cyclops was a strange fella. An investigation into him by the Office of Naval Intelligence revealed that Captain George W. Worley was born Johann Friedrich Wichmann. And not only that, he was born in Germany in 1862, and he told the Navy that he was born in 1865. I don't know if he told the Navy he was born in Germany. That information was not found. But he did lie about his age. And he lied to say that he was younger. Most people would lie to say that they're older, so that way they could join the military. I don't know why he would lie to say that he was young. Anyway, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. And back then, many people were immigrants to this country. So not being born in America wasn't such a big deal. And if you remember anything about either of the world wars, they were both against Germany. So Wichmann's got some or Worley, excuse me, he's got some explaining to do. Wichmann entered America by jumping ship in San Francisco in 1878. And in 1898, so 20 years later, he changed his name to Worley after a seaman friend of his. So I don't know who this guy was, why he decided to name himself after it, but he was 36 years old when he changed his name, and he also had been living in San Francisco for 20 years when he changed his name. So people knew him as Wichmann. When he did live in San Francisco, he owned and operated a saloon with the help of his brothers, whom he had convinced to immigrate as well. And during this time, he qualified for the position of ship's master and commanded several civilian merchant ships. He would pick up and deliver cargo with these merchant ships. It wasn't always legal. In fact, many people, when asked about this guy, People were like, yeah, he did all kinds of illegal shit. Like, shady. He was known as a bully to his crew as well. Because what good German captain isn't a bully? So he would go off on people about trivial things all the time. And then he decided, I'm going to join the Navy. So Worley was commissioned as a lieutenant commander in the Naval Auxiliary Reserve on February 21st of 1917. Of course, being in the Navy didn't change his demeanor. He would just berate and curse officers and men, and sometimes he would get violent over things because, that's what you do. So it is actually said that he chased an ensign around the ship with a pistol at one point. Like, literally was chasing him with his gun. I don't know if he was going to shoot him. I don't know what he was chasing him about, but he was chasing this guy. And just for reference, an ensign is an 01 and a lieutenant commander is an 04. And I'm assuming that ranks really haven't changed that much, so that was still the thing back then. And ensign is also a name for the flag. So you can call, like, it's an ensign if you're looking at the flag, but it's also an ensign if you're an 01. So don't look at me and be like, oh, you don't know anything. Were you even in the Navy? I was. That's a real thing. Anyway, back to this. And so when he wasn't being a complete asshole, he would walk around the ship in his long underwear and a derby hat. So, like, he was either berating all the officers on the ship. It seems like, in my research, it doesn't seem like there were many enlisted people on this ship. It was just officers and the crew. So maybe the crew was enlisted. I don't know. But they mention the officers, the ship's officers, and the crew. But they don't really mention, like, enlisted. So I'm assuming that the crew is enlisted. But basically stay out of this guy's way, because you're either going to get a pistol to the face or you're going to see him in his long underwear and his derby hat. What a fun guy. He was a bit eccentric, that's for sure. He would sometimes have an inexperienced officer in charge of loading the cargo on the ship. And while, like, this makes total sense to have, like, a new guy learning the ropes, that's not really what happened, because he would literally confine the experienced officer to his quarters instead of letting him help. So you're confined, go to your room, we're going to lock you in. This guy who's never done this before, you're in charge. You go load it. And it was like a way to, like, be an asshole is basically what it was. He was just being a dick. So that's what happened in Rio when all this cargo was loaded before the ship vanished, is that he had some inexperienced officer load the ship while all the experienced guys were, like, locked in their quarters. But the problem was that the ship wasn't used to carrying manganese ore. And so this trip, like, it's just something a collier didn't typically carry. And so even for an experienced loader, this would have been a really unfamiliar load. So let's make an unfamiliar guy, like an inexperienced guy, load an unfamiliar load, and we're going to call it all good. So maybe the ship was overloaded because this guy, whoever loaded it, had no idea what they were doing. But I don't know. I mean, the records still say that it wasn't overloaded, although maybe they just, like, changed the records to cover their asses in Brazil. I don't know. I'm just saying that the record says it wasn't overloaded, that you think that this letter from the consul in Barbados would have mentioned something about the ship being overloaded, but he didn't. He mentioned that they got more food and stuff, but he didn't mention that it was overloaded, so that seems odd to me as well. So, I don't know. You guys make your own decision if you think the ship was overloaded or not. I have no idea whether it was or wasn't. I know that everyone likes to blame the fact that it was overloaded on the disappearance. I'm not sold on that. It could have still been overloaded. I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm just saying I'm not sold on the fact that it was overloaded caused the disappearance of the ship. But you also have to remember that Worley was German. So many accusations against him claim that he was pro-German during wartime and may have colluded with the enemy. And his closest friends were all German or Americans from German descent. And, I mean, there were also a lot of Germans on the ship during its last voyage, to include the consul general from Rio. So apparently he was also very pro-German. But here's the thing, though. people like to hang out with people that are like them. So, for example, I have a Chinese friend, and most of her friends are Chinese. Now, don't get me wrong, she's friends with me, and I'm not Chinese. So she obviously has friends that are not Chinese, but the majority of her friends are Chinese. People like to hang out with people that are similar to them. It's just what you like to do. You have things in common. You hang out with people that you have things in common with. So for Germans to hang out with other Germans, especially when they're immigrating to a new country that they've never been in, that makes sense to me. So I'm not trying to like that doesn't seem like a huge red flag. You know, like yes, he was German. He immigrated to America and he has German friends. That's not like a smoking gun. I have white female friends. That doesn't mean that I only side with white female. That doesn't mean anything. I don't, you know what I'm saying? The thought is that the consul general from Rio and Worley collaborated to hand the ship over to the Germans because apparently they're both pro-German. And I don't know if they were or they were not. I'm not on the ship with them. I have no idea. But after the war, the German records were checked to see if that's what happened. So basically, they wanted to see if Germany had gotten a ship and it was the USS Cyclops and they just killed all the people on board besides the Germans, or if maybe like one of their submarines had attacked the Cyclops and sank it, and if that like it was a basically if the war had contributed to the Cyclops disappearing. None of the records showed that a submarine attacked it, and you think that that would have been something that they almost bragged about because they're like, "Oh, look at us like defeating the Americans," but they didn't have it in any other record books, and also they didn't have like I don't know. And also, why would the Germans want? Don't get me wrong. Obviously, they would want the manganese ore because it's going to help in creating steel and hardening steel, making it really tough. But that's not like again, that's not something like extra rare or anything. It's not like they couldn't get it themselves. It wasn't like classified documents from American government. I don't know. It's nothing really that impressive that you would want to give to the Germans. You think that if you're going to hand over a ship to the Germans to like be in favor of them, then you would hand over something that's worth it to them. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure this is nice, but this isn't like going to help them win the war in the end. Like it didn't. But also, there's no records to show that the Germans ever got the Cyclops. And that would have been like a really cut and dry, easy way to be like, yep, that's what happened to the ship. But no, that is not what happened. The consul from Barbados thought something was up. He definitely thought something was up. He was kind of like leaning towards this German theory. So he wrote this to the State Department near the time the search for the Cyclops was called off. It says, Department's 15th, confidential. Master Cyclops stated that required 600 tons coal having sufficient on board to reach Bermuda. Engines very poor condition. Not sufficient funds and therefore requested payment by me. Unusual reticent. I have ascertained he took here ton fresh meat, ton flour, 1,000 pounds vegetables, paying therefore $775. From different sources gathered the following. He had plenty of coal. Alleged inferior. Took coal to mix. Probably had more than 1,500 tons. Master alluded to by others as damned Dutchman, apparently disliked by other officers. Rumored disturbances en route hither. Men confined and one executed. Also had some prisoners from the fleet in Brazilian waters. One life sentence. United States Consul General Gottschalk, passenger. 231 crew exclusive of officers and passengers. Have names of crew but not of all the officers and passengers. Many Germanic names appear. Number telegraphic or wireless messages addressed to master or in care of ship were delivered at this port. All telegrams from Barbados on file, head office, St. Thomas. I have to suggest scrutiny there. While not having any definite grounds, I fear fate worse than sinking, though possibly based on instinctive dislike felt towards mass. And then it was signed Livingston, Consul. So Livingston was the name of the guy. So he was kind of like leaning towards, like, there's a lot of Germans on board. They took extra coal, even though they didn't really need extra coal. They have all this extra food. He was like, something seems weird. He wasn't really, forthcoming as to what he was feeling, or he was kind of more secretive than it was. It was just weird. Everything was weird, and he wasn't liked by a lot of his crew, and I don't know. So this guy Livingston was leaning towards the German theory that he was giving the ship over to Germany, and this was again written near the time that the ship was called, the search was called off for the ship. So I don't know if this kind of pushed the search over the edge, and they were like, yeah, we're done. Don't waste our resources if they gave them to Germany. We'll figure it out when the war is over, basically. So the most popular theory, and the one I like the best, especially because there's no evidence that Germany ever got the Cyclops, is that the ship was lost in the Bermuda Triangle. So make sure you come back next week to learn everything I can find about the Bermuda Triangle, because that's going to be next week's episode, because I think that's what makes the most sense. You never found any evidence. There's no evidence to suggest that the Cyclops was there was structural failure, that it was given to the Germans, any of these things that they're that make sense to, puts in their head that, it's cut and dry. This is what they did. But the Bermuda Triangle seems to be a place of disappearances, of shady happenings. So we love those kind of things here at the Rabbit Hole. So we're going to cover the Bermuda Triangle next week. Like I said, you do not have to listen to this episode to understand that one, or listen to that episode to understand this one. I will probably mention the Cyclops in the Bermuda Triangle episode, just because I'm pretty sure it disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. That's my theory. It's the one that makes the most sense here. I don't know. I'm going to put a poll. I like my polls. I'm going to put one on Instagram. You tell me what you think. But also, one of my sources in my show notes, it goes over the postage, how it was kind of different on the Cyclops than it was anywhere else in the Navy during World War I decided not to add that. It wasn't really conspiratorial. It didn't really add to the disappearance aspect of the ship, but I thought I would just let you guys know, if you're into postage and postmarks and different things like that, the stamps that they stamp on your letters and your envelopes, that's something you can go read about. It wasn't something that really added to the disappearance. I don't think anything, they're well, maybe the ship disappeared with all these letters on board, and I'm sure it did, but I don't think it disappeared because of the letters that were on board. And also, a lot of my information that I got was from Wikipedia. And I know Wikipedia is not a great source, but I wanted to kind of cover my butt here, is that everywhere I looked, it was the same story. It was the Wikipedia story. It was just copied and pasted everywhere. So wherever you look for it, it's basically the same information. Wikipedia just had the whole story, whereas people would cut and paste parts of the Wikipedia story. But the YouTube was good. I think that you guys could watch the YouTube and you'd enjoy it. But anyway, done with my rambling. Until next week, my friends, stay skeptical, and I will see you all very soon. Hey friends, The Rabbit Hole is an independent podcast with everything you hear done by me, Danny Mercy. I appreciate all of your support. Please rate and review wherever you're listening. If you want to follow us on Instagram, it's at rabbit.holepodcast. And thank you, Zakar Balaha, for our awesome intro.